Well, hello, my name is Earll Murman, and I'm a retired MIT professor from the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. I was pleased to teach there 26 years and was department head for 6 years. And I moved to Port Townsend, Washington after I retired. And one of my friends is Quentin Wald, who was the class of 1941 in course 16. So we're going to chat this morning a little bit about Quentin's experience as a student and his career and what he's done in 39 years since he retired. Okay. So Quentin, let me start with the origin question. How did you get to MIT and why did you go there?
Well, my father was a naval inspector of aircraft, and I can remember he was in charge of the assembly of a racing seaplane on the North Shore of Long Island, and he often brought me to his place of work. I can remember collecting snails in the shadow of the racing aircraft. And I was very interested in so much of what he did as a technical person and aircraft. So as a very young child, I decided I want to design airplanes. As it turned out, when I got to MIT, I knew I didn't want to design. I wanted to understand, study aerodynamics.
So how was it that you were able to go to MIT?
Well, that's a long story. My father was a child in Brooklyn, New York. He had four sisters. His parents had come from Germany and were supporting his big family. And then, very unfortunate circumstance, their mother was killed in an automobile accident.
This is your grandmother.
My grandmother, and the grandfather was killed in an industrial accident when the oldest of the family was 16. My father had just finished fifth grade. That was the end of his education. It was a struggle for the family to survive. And they did various things. In the end, they did quite well, but they were poor. They were very young when they were working in New York. My father eventually became a seaman on a tramp steamer, which stopped in Manila, Philippine Islands. And there, he thought that was a rather interesting city he'd like to look. So he jumped ship and got a job in Manila. And he was in Manila for several years when he read in the newspaper of the Wrights' first successful flight. And he said, "That's for me." He came back to the States. He went first to Dayton and asked the Wrights for a job. They said, well, get some skill that we can use, and then we'll hire you. So he went back to his native Brooklyn and worked, and he took good courses in machining and other industrial things. So he continued to pester the Wrights frequently, reminding them that they had promised to give him a job. And finally, they did hire him. And he worked as a machinist for a short time in their factory. And I don't know how he managed it, but then they taught him to fly. He persuaded the Wrights to teach him to fly, and he did. And this employment with the Wrights enabled him to move from a poor and ignorant person to a occupier of quite good jobs. During the First World War, he was in charge of the inspection department of the Curtis Company in Buffalo, New York. And so it meant all of his life, he could get good jobs because of his Wright experience. And that meant that he was able to send me to MIT.
You told me that you were a member of the glider club.
Yes.
As an undergraduate, and that there was something interesting that happened there. So could you tell me a little bit about the glider club?
Well, yes. It was a group of boys, 6 or 8 boys, who had a glider. I don't know where the glider came from, but we had a glider. There was no faculty supervision whatsoever. It was totally off MIT's awareness. And the glider was launched by towing with an automobile with a long rope. And I was launched one day and off I went. The launching area was flat, clear space, but then I went out over woodland. And I finally decided, well, it's time to turn around and get back to the launching area. I was flying over trees, and I just had gone a little too far, and I found myself descending terrace in an area which was not flat and clear. And as it turned out, I went into the glider with the wing struts on both sides, on the sides of the ditch. The struts were damaged and bent. The glider was not ruined, it was restored, but it was a clumsy effort.
Were there any faculty members that you remember as undergraduate teachers that particularly influenced you?
I can't say that they particularly influenced me because I had a very strong desire that was established. But when I attended classes by professors over Otto Koppen, Markham, and my favorite was Rauscher, who was an Austrian. And shortly after I left MIT, he returned to Austria. Not that long time. But his course, sort of a general approach to aerodynamics, I liked very much.
At that time, the department required a senior thesis as part of the degree program. And you wrote your thesis on helicopter stability.
Yes. Oh, what happened was I was fascinated with the idea of helicopters. Igor Sikorsky gave a talk at MIT. Mostly it was about his flying boats. But anyway, I asked him for a suggestion as to what my thesis subject might be, and he suggested the stability of helicopters. And that is what I did. I did exactly that. And it was a very long and complicated thesis. I was just looking at it. I have it here. And I could not be sure that I would have a conclusion, successful analysis. Well, apparently I did. And there was the James Means Memorial Prize for the best thesis on an aeronautical topic. I won that prize.
Well, I can tell you, having been department head, that winning the James Bean Prize is pretty impressive. It's really given for the best student project in the senior year of aeronautical engineering. And you still have that medal, don't you?
Yes, I have it here.
For the last, whatever it is, 85 years or something.
Well, it's been on the top of my bookshelf in my bedroom.
Okay. Well, congratulations, yeah.
I was working for United Aircraft at the time. That was my first couple of years after graduation. And I was sent to the Sikorsky division to observe a flight of the VS-300, the first really successful little helicopter. And I went down to Bridgeport, and there I went out with a hoop on the end of a pole, which I held up. And Sikorsky flew the VS-300 nose pole through the hoop and then backed off again without touching it. Really very precise control. And I was very pleased to make what I felt was a historical first. But anyway, we go on from there. I decided that I needed more mathematics. So I quit my job. I took my wife and child to Cambridge. I sold my house and moved. And the first day I arrived, I had been signed up for a master's degree program. I arrived at the class, and somebody got up and announced that Professor so-and-so's work, which was the thing that I really wanted, would not be given this year, that he was in. I had rearranged my whole life to see that, to see this man.
And this was the course you really wanted to take, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
And it wasn't available. Well, that was a disappointment. But I stayed on. I was enrolled as a student. So I spent 2 semesters in the summer searching for math courses that would be useful to me. And I found that some of the teaching was so limited. One professor in particular, he just talked fast for a whole hour, and one had the choice of writing down what he had to say without understanding it, or understanding it and losing the numerical source.
So you spent, after your master's degree, you pretty much spent the rest of your career in the hydrodynamics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had worked on a number of strange projects, including one for a high-speed ocean vessel, a naval vessel, to be 3,000-ton vessel with a capability of 80 knots. And it was to do this by riding a bubble of air, a cushion of air. This was accomplished by 2 very narrow catamaran-like hulls, and then a planing seal at bow and stern. But this was a big project. A number of companies were involved. And it provided me with an occupation for some years, but in the end, the project was canceled by the Navy before anything was built. One project that fascinated me was a a project to obtain energy from the ocean, from the difference between the temperature at the surface and at the depth, at great depth. The project was afoot, which involved 10 to 20 foot diameter pipes, vertical pipes, from the surface to the bottom. And the dynamics of these tubes hanging from a surface vessel, their dynamics was very much a project.
And these tubes were thousands of feet long.
Thousands of people.
Yeah.
I was quite interested in the dynamics of these tubes, but then that project collapsed. And, I ended up working on hydrodynamic development of submarines for an electric boat company.
I read your essay that you wrote called "My Life as an Engineer," which, by the way, I've read twice. I really enjoy it, and it's a good, to me, it's a good example of how one's career just sort of unfolds in front of them. One thing leads to another, and but at the end, towards the end, you say that you found after your, these years you went to school and worked, that you found out that what you really like to do was modeling, to take some physical problem and develop a mathematical model that, particularly for fluid mechanics, and that's where you found you had your most enjoyment. And that when you wrote that article, I think you wrote it in 1995, you said, well, kind of to have something to do in retirement, I think I'll write something about the aerodynamics of propellers.
Yes.
As sort of an exercise to keep your mind.
And I continued now and then thinking about aerodynamics and propellers and developing treatments of various aspects of propeller design. And I just worked at this now and then, just out of just general interest. And I finally decided I had accumulated enough, and I had a really mastered treatment of propeller design, and I went to this publication, and they published it. And it's an extensive article. It's 120 some pages.
When I look at this article, it's the quality of a PhD thesis. So another thing you did and have done in retirement is write a book on the Wright brothers flyer.
Yes, my father's treatment of the Wrights, I was quite interested in what they had done. And I finally decided that it was time for me to write a book about the Wrights. There are many books about the Wrights, but they're written by literary people, and they have nothing to say about their evolution of their thoughts on the engineering of a flying machine. And my book is a critique of the Wrights engineering work.
The Wright brothers were not educated engineers. They were bicycle builders.
They were bicycle builders.
Yeah, so they had not gotten an undergraduate degree in aeronautical engineering. Probably didn't even exist at that time.
Yeah.
But in your book, you capture how they did some pretty sophisticated, at that time, sophisticated engineering.
Yes. In particular, they had developed a small four-cylinder engine for their aircraft, and they were low-powered engines. During my days, sailing, I had started to write some poetry, and I was kind of surprised because in my middle age, I would have laughed if you said I could write poetry. But I just voluntarily, I felt interested in handling the language. And I gave a lot of this stuff to some friends who were also sailing in the Mediterranean. And I didn't know it at the time, but they had done some publishing. And they finally approached me and asked me if they could publish a book of my poetry, which they did. On my 100th birthday, Earl collected a lot of my writing, poetry and philosophy, and produced this book. This is my 100th birthday book. And I must say, I think you did a beautiful job. Everything in there, I would accept. There was nothing in that, that I had been very clumsy with. And I value this book very much.
It was fun to work on it, and this was during the pandemic. This came out in June 2020, I think.
2020, June 4th, 2020.
So we were in the middle.
This book appeared.
Yeah, we were in the middle of a pandemic, and
I was 100 years old.
Yeah, kind of thinking about things. You're now 103. It's a long ways back to when you were 17 when you went to MIT. You were born in 1920.
Yes.
It's a long time. If you had to do it all over again, would you do it the same way, or would you choose a different path?
Well, life is not something that you can predict ahead of time. And possibly there's the same life will work in.
Yeah.
It's always different. Something happens.
It's an appropriate comment for you too.